Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation, Exemplars of Assessment in Higher Education, Diverse Approaches to Addressing Accreditation Standards. Today's event kicks off the Middle States Commission on Higher Education's fall webinars, and we are happy to have more than 700 colleagues joining us today. During this event, various chapters from the book, which was published in June 2021, by the Association for the Assessment of Learning in Higher Education and Stylus Publishing, will be discussed. You will be introduced shortly to today's presenters, but first a few housekeeping items. There is no need to speed read through this disclaimer, but I do want to remind everyone that this presentation remains the property of the Commission, and if you have specific questions related to your institution, you should outreach to your Commission Vice President Liaison. Also note that this presentation is being recorded, and we will be sharing this recording through our website and our YouTube channel. At the end of the presentation, we have allotted time for question and answer. Today, we will be using the chat feature in Zoom for you to submit questions. The chat feature can be located at the bottom of your window. Please note that we are not using the Q&A feature, but just the chat feature. Should your question be asked during the presentation, we will not use any identifying information, either your name or your institution. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible as they are submitted, but know that some may not be addressed during this due to time constraints today. Thank you again for joining us. And it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Marie Souza.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. I want to welcome you first for joining us today. I'm very happy that so many have expressed interest in this topic. I would like to begin by introducing you to the speakers that you'll be hearing from today. My name is Marie Souza. I'm the Associate Provost for Academic Administration and the Accreditation Liaison Officer at the University of Rochester. I'm also the co-editor of Exemplars of Assessment in Higher Education. And I will be talking to you today a little bit about how the book came about and why it might be very useful to you. My co-editor, Tara A. Rose, the Director of Assessment at Louisiana State University, will be talking to you and explaining how the book is organized and the different types of institutions that are represented there. Then we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Heather Perfetti, the president, of course, of Middle States Commission on Higher Education and the author of the foreword for the book. She also played a very critical role in the development of this book, and I'll discuss that in a few moments. We'll also be hearing from Nancy Ritchie and Dawn Hayward. Nancy is the Dean of Research, Planning and Assessment at Bronx Community College of the University of New York, and Dawn, the Assistant Vice President for Assessment and Compliance at Gwynedd University. And they're going to be discussing in more detail their Chapter 20 that deals with institutional effectiveness assessment. Next slide, please. I have to begin by thanking the contributing authors. We had so many people contribute to this book. There were 24 institutions involved, and Tara will tell you more about that. But each one of these individuals, I want to thank them for their time, their expertise, and their patience with Tara and me as we went back and forth with many edits. They were terribly generous with their time and their energy and their expertise. So a big thank you, shout out to all the contributing authors. Next. So a little bit about how this book came about. It's on a theme that you'll hear a lot about today, and that's accreditors as partners in this quest for institutional quality, for educational quality. AALHE has long had an involvement with accreditors, and I should mention that both Tara and I have served as president of the Association for Assessment of Learning in Higher Education. So we've been on the board and very much involved in this and looking for ways to partner with accreditors. And this partnership really started, I would say, in 2014, when the publication intersection, at the time, David Eubanks was the editor-in-chief, and he published an interview with one of the accreditors. It was actually from SAC-COC. I took over as editor-in-chief of the intersection and loved this idea because I truly believe in accreditors as partners. And so as editor-in-chief, I went on to have a conversation with the accreditor published in every edition of the intersection until we had all the former regional accreditors represented and the Distance Education Commission. So the popularity of wanting to hear from accreditors directly, it became very clear that our membership wanted to hear from accreditors. So we started 6 years ago, we started a panel session at the annual conference for AALHE. And that panel consisted of several members of different accrediting bodies were invited to come and discuss current topics. And then we opened it up to anyone who was in attendance. What kind of questions do you have for our accreditors? And I'm pleased to say that Middle State's, our own Heather Perfetti, has served multiple times as a panelist at the conference. And Steve Puglisi, who is the Vice President and Chief of Staff of Middle States, has also served. And he did the last 2 years at the AALHE conference. So that has been a very good event, well-attended event. And it was after this one such of these events that I've been moderating for 6 years that Tara Rose came up to me and said, you know, all of the people are asking about, they want to know about what the accreditors think is good assessment. We've answered questions in general, but wouldn't it be great to have specific examples? So we were chatting, and this was in 2019, and Tara and I were brainstorming, and we said, gee, we wonder if the accreditors would be willing to actually call out institutions and say, hey, these people did really good work. I didn't know if that would fly. So I called upon Dr. Heather Perfetti and discussed the idea that Tara and I had and asked if she thought that accreditors would be willing to give us some exemplars. And she not only encouraged us in this, but offered 5 different institutions as exemplars from the Middle States Commission area. So she was very, very critical in us moving forward in this. We brought the idea to Stylus. They were also very supportive. And by January of 2020, we had enough exemplars to put this book together. Next slide. The accreditors that contributed, there were 12 in all, and I'm happy to report that all 7 of the former regional accreditors did send us exemplars, along with 5 different specialized accrediting bodies that you will see here. We're very, very grateful for them for their sending us these institutions. Next slide. So this vision became, we want to offer to the audience a collection of exemplars of assessment in higher education that were all suggested to us by accreditors. So folks have often asked, did we pick and choose which ones were included in the book? And the truth is we did not. We took all of the suggestions of the 12 accreditors that were sent to us, and it amounted to 20 chapters. So the important takeaway here is that all of these came from accrediting bodies. And Tara and I, though we edited the book, we did not edit the selection that came from our accrediting agencies. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Perfetti to offer us a few words.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that kind and generous introduction. I first want to thank Jane Marie and Tara as the editors as well. If you know them, if you've had any engagement with them, you know that they hold such a passion for the many ways that assessment serves to improve learning for our students. And it truly is that passion that led to their work through AALHE and ultimately this publication. I have also appreciated Jane Marie and Tara's inclusion of accreditors in the important conversations with AALHE so that we could promote our role as partners in the important and innovative work being done at institutions, as opposed to being seen as the regulators who offer little value. As Jane Marie indicated, our commission's relationship goes back many years with AALHE. And I remember initially working with Jane Marie to ensure that our commission was included in the interview she was conducting with all of the accreditors as part of their publication, Intersection. That was truly the start of all that was to come. As you heard, AALHE just celebrated its 6th anniversary year of hosting conversations with accreditors at their conference. And our commission has participated in 5 of those 6. Our focus together has always been about leveraging assessment for the benefit of students and making the institution the very best that it can be, as opposed to seeing accreditation assessment as a process solely designed for the purpose of meeting commission expectations, whether ours or others. I have to thank AALHE as an organization for focusing on the important work of assessment and for encouraging critical dialogue that has included us as accreditors. Every conference, every conversation has led to new understandings and improved practices. AALHE's willingness to co-publish this important piece on assessment with Stylus and invite my perspective through the foreword is truly appreciated. And the timing of when this all came together turned out to be more ideal than we could have ever planned. The mission of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education continues to reflect a commitment to institutional improvement through self-appraisal and peer review, and that is unwavering. It is not possible to serve students as best we can without quality assessment. This is reflected throughout our commission's requirements of affiliation and standards for accreditation. I do have to thank the Middle States institutions that contributed, as well as those others beyond our commission who contributed to this publication. This was intended to offer an array of diverse assessment approaches in the hopes that we all could learn from the best practices of others and share with each other as well as with the public the good work of our institutions. Those who stepped up to be featured reflect what I refer to as champions of assessment. Those individuals who celebrate assessment from a perspective focused upon quality and improvement for the benefit of students rather than through a lens of compliance. This offers a more complete narrative than what often gets circulated, and we are so very proud of each chapter. This is a celebratory publication for each of our champions of assessment and for our institutions, as well as collectively for the higher education community, including for those of us who do the work of accreditation. I don't want to delay us any further getting to the exceptional information that our panelists have to share today. On behalf of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, I thank you all for the contributions to the publication, for being here with us today, and for the work that you carry every day at your institutions to improve the student experience within and beyond the classroom. The foreword is simply reflective of the many years of our shared commitment to the value of assessment. And I sincerely thank Jane Marie, Tara, Nancy, and Dawn for serving as panelists today, AALHE and Stylus Publishing, and all others who have leveraged assessment and continue to serve as models for others. I would like to now return the program back to Tara.
Thank you, Heather. I'd like to share with you all the diversity of institutions that we have represented in the book. As Jane Marie mentioned earlier, all of the institutions were suggested by their accreditors, and we did not pick and choose or select which institutions were a part of our book. Even though there were 24 institutions represented in our book, there were many more that were actually recommended by accreditors. We reached out to all of them, and it just so happened that 24 of those that were recommended were interested in moving forward within our book. So though we weren't directly focused on the diversity of institutions, right, because we did not select them, Jane Marie and I were very surprised and quite pleased with how diverse they actually were. So you'll see here on this slide that the institution diversity makeup included 12 private institutions, 9 public four-year institutions, 7 minority serving institutions, 4 Hispanic serving institutions, 3 land grant institutions, 3 public 2-year institutions, and 1 tribal institutions. So you can see here that represented, we have institutions that provide opportunities for students from diverse economic, cultural, and educational backgrounds. What we are missing that Jane Marie and I would have liked to have seen was the inclusion of an HBCU, and we did not have that. So perhaps maybe in our second book, we'll be sure to include an HBCU institution in the future. Next slide, please. Just want to give a shout out to all the institutions, just like the many contributing authors that we have. Here is a list of all the institutions that were represented in the book and in their institutional logos. Next slide, please. So once the accreditors provided suggested institutions, what we did, Jane Marie and I, we contacted and reached out individually to every institution, asking if they would be willing to work with us. We provided them with a list of the many assessment related areas. To list a few, they had an option to write about assessment in the discipline, co-curricular assessment, gen ed assessment, online learning, program reviews, scholarship of teaching and learning, student learning technology, and so forth. We were very fortunate to end up with so many different perspectives and so many different topics to share with you, especially since we were relying on what the accreditors gave us. So it just so happened that it turned out to be a great cross-section of institutions and topics. We did ask the institutions to consider their last accreditation self-study report and determine which area to present for their submission. Based on the topics the institutions chose, we narrowed them down to 4 overarching themes. You'll see here, part 1 is student learning and assessment, which included 10 chapters and 10 institutions. Part 2, student learning and assessment in the disciplines, which included 4 chapters and 7 institutions. Part 3, faculty engagement and assessment. It included 2 chapters and 2 institutions. And the last section, part 4, included institutional effectiveness and assessment. And it had 4 chapters and 5 institutions. So our goal is that the diverse effective assessment approaches that you find throughout this book provides you with real-world examples of what works in assessment. And at this time, next slide, please. I would like to introduce the chapter authors for chapter 20. Do we have it? Do we do it? And does it work? Dawn Hayward, Nancy Ritze, and co-author not presenting Rebecca Golan. Dawn and Nancy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nancy and I are delighted to be meeting with you today for this opportunity to describe the use of what we're calling a 3-question framework. Do we have it? Do we do it? Does it work? For addressing accreditation standards and for ensuring institutional effectiveness. Nancy and I are sharing examples from our 2 quite different types of institutions. Nancy comes from a large open access community college in Bronx, New York. My institution, Gwynedd Mercy University, is a master's medium 4-year private Catholic university located in suburban Philadelphia. We're hoping that sharing examples from our two very different institutions will help you, and sharing examples of how we've used our framework can help you with the work of your own institution. But before we get started, let's pause for a moment just to discuss the purpose of a self-study process and the purpose of using a 3-question framework to meet the needs of a self-study process. So Brian, would you mind forwarding to the next slide? And Nancy?
Sure. When Dawn and I first met, we discovered that despite our vast institutional differences, that we embarked on self-study with very similar perspectives. And we had both completed our self-studies and evaluation visits in spring 2019. And what we did was we approached the self-study process with a focus on institutional improvement as the primary focus. And in so doing, we reflected on the institution's greatest strengths, identified the most difficult challenges, and developed plans for improvement. In doing this, we were able to both verify the institution was in compliance with the Middle State Standards for Accreditation and requirements of affiliation. And Dawn will talk a little bit more about the specific approach taken. Next slide.
So let's talk about the purpose of using these 3 questions. Preparing self-studies can feel like an overwhelming process, especially for faculty and staff new to the process or new to your institution. We found that asking 3 relatively simple questions helps everyone to focus everyone's attention on what specifically we need to find in order to demonstrate compliance, and that the process of asking and answering those questions will help the members of the institution figure out, identify what needs to be fixed. So before we begin with examples, let's review the 3 questions just one by one. So Brian, next slide. So the first question in this 3-question framework is, do we have it? Think of it as a scavenger hunt. What you're trying to identify and find the plans and policies that support each standard. And where are those plans and policies? For standard 1, for mission and goals, for standard 2, ethics and integrity, for standard 3, design and delivery. Sometimes you have to dig through file drawers, sometimes you have to ask your colleagues, but you're going to be able to find all of the plans and policies that align with that and support that particular Middle States standard of excellence. But it isn't enough to have the plans and policies, because those are examples of good intentions. All of our institutions need also to have a process for implementing those policies and plans. That's our second question. Brian? Second question is this: do we do it? Do we have a process for implementing those policies and plans that we discovered that we have? It isn't enough to plan to do something. You have to have or to have a written policy. You have to have active practice and to be doing something. And that is the question that you're attempting to answer with the second in the 3-question framework. Do we do it? Do you have evidence of a process? Do you have evidence of practice? Which committee is responsible for making sure that that plan and policy is implemented in the institution? Does that committee have bylaws? Are there minutes? Is there evidence that that committee has been meeting regularly? Or is there an individual who's been tasked with making certain that those plans and policies are implemented within the institution? The third question is the most critical question of all. Does it work? Maybe the plan isn't working. Maybe there is no written policy. Maybe you discover that the process isn't working because a committee hasn't been meeting regularly, because there's no named person who's responsible for overseeing the process. Or maybe you have a plan and a process that is working, but maybe it's not working for everyone, and maybe it's not working as intended. In the next few slides, Nancy and I are going to share specific examples from our institution for every question in this 3-question. Do we have it? Do we do it? Does it work? And we're going to provide examples of our institution, whether we met these or did not meet these questions. And in the interest of time, we're only going to be providing limited examples for every single standard, but we invite you to read the book for more examples. And also please know that Nancy and I will be happy to answer any questions at the end of this webinar. So Nancy, let's start with examples for standard 1.
Okay, so for standard 1, mission and goals, do we have it? The answer for us was yes. And you can see by the green dot, that's when we indicate a yes. If it were a red dot, it would be a no, and a yellow dot would indicate partial. So yes, we have a planning, budgeting, and assessment model in place. Do we do it? Yes, was our answer. Oversight by Strategic Planning and Assessment Committee, and engagement across the campus in the activities that were set forth in our planning, budgeting, and assessment model. And the third question, does it work? For this example, we said again, yes. We assessed perception and quantitative indicators, which suggested that for this standard, yes, it worked. Next slide. So what were some of our key findings? Here's one for us, that over the course of the decade between our last self-study and the most recent one, we tripled our 3-year graduation rate, which we thought resulted from implementation of specific goals that were part of our strategic plan. And what were some of the next steps that we identified? To assure that the new strategic plan would incorporate recommendations from our self-study and would address scaling the best practices that had been identified in the self-study. Next slide.
So for standard 2, ethics and integrity, the faculty and staff at my institution at Gwynedd University, when we asked the question, do we have it? Do we have policies and plans in place? One example of one of our critically important policies supporting ethics and integrity as a standard at our institution were the presence of our diversity, inclusivity, and non-discrimination policies. There's no question those policies are in place at my institution. Do we do it? Are we actively implementing those policies within my institution? And the answer to that question was yes. We had evidence of practice that occurred during the conversations that matter, the dialogues we held across campus. But does it work? That question led to an interesting and an important finding. When we looked at the results of the Harry Diverse Learning Environment Survey results for student learning, Brian, would you turn to the next slide? We found that the experience of the students did not indicate that they were perceiving their experience in this climate in the same way. It's a very key finding. So even though we had a policy in place, even though we had active practice in place at the institution, we had evidence that our students were not perceiving that policy in the same way. So as a result of that key finding, we identified as our next step, was to revise our strategic plan for the institution to include an initiative for empowered community. But we also went one step further. It wasn't enough to change and update the plan. We also, at my institution, hired a person, an assistant VP for diversity, equity, and inclusion to lead this plan forward and to lead this initiative for the institution. Brian, next slide.
Okay, for standard 3, design and delivery of the student learning experience. The first question, do we have it? The answer was yes. We have professional development for faculty and an assessment program focused on effective pedagogy and student learning. Do we do it? Yes. We have systematic assessments of teaching practice and student learning outcomes. Most important question here, does it work? What we found was that high impact practices implemented by faculty in their classes were associated with strong student learning outcomes and success. But what we found, next slide, please, is that the utilization of high impact practices was improving, but not consistently applied. And so what we wanted to think about how to do was, how do we get more faculty utilizing these high impact practices, which we were able to demonstrate were supporting student success and student learning. And so what next steps did we develop? We developed roadmaps of successful professional development programs built around student-centered pedagogy, and are trying to apply them now. And certainly it's been something that's been very useful during the need for remote learning during the pandemic. So we took sort of a left turn because we didn't necessarily focus on exactly what we thought we would, but we did have the infrastructure in place. So we'll be looking at that going forward. Next slide, please.
So at my institution, we had a similar finding, but we chose a slightly different path. Do we have it? We definitely had evidence in the program curricula that we included high impact practices. We definitely had evidence that we do it because the syllabi provided evidence of practice. But does it work? The MSCHE results indicated that our participation rates in high impact practices were lower than the regional average. Next slide, please. So we included as our next step to include increasing participation rates in high impact practices in our strategic plan. Next slide. Support of the student experience for Standard 4 involved also, do we have it, our scavenger hunt for the plans and the policies. And we found that one example is that we do have a strategic enrollment plan. What we discovered in looking at that strategic enrollment plan is it hadn't been updated in some time and it wasn't fully articulated. Do we do it? Do we have evidence of practice? Absolutely. We have an enrollment management team who is charged with determining the admissions at the institution. And does it work? We have assessment of student retention and graduation rates that indicate that our students are retained and graduating at levels higher than our regional peers. Next slide. But it was a key finding that our plan was not fully developed. And it was one of our recommendations that Middle States provided us as part of the self-study, was to develop and implement a fully articulated strategic enrollment plan. Next slide. Educational effectiveness assessment, Standard 5, was also simple to find the plans and the policies. One example at my institution for answering the question, do we have it, was yes, we have an institutional assessment plan and schedule. Good for us. Do we do it? The answer was yes. We have an institutional outcomes assessment committee that's specifically charged with reviewing the assessment results. We also have other committees, faculty, program coordinators and directors. But when we assessed assessment as part of our institutional outcomes assessment committee, next slide, we discovered that we're doing assessment at all levels, but we need to use the assessment findings. And our next steps involved increasing the efforts for accountability. And as a result, that we've made remarkable progress in fixing that we now have peer aspirant competitor institutions identified, that we have new leadership in the institution actively using assessment data to improve institutional practice. Next slide.
Standard 6 for planning, resources, and institutional improvement. Do we have it? We found yes. We have strategic plan and goals which are aligned with the City University of New York, with Middle States, and across all of our campus departments. Do we do it? Yes, we have annual and periodic planning and assessment reports that document investments that lead to improvement. And does it work? Somewhat. Our perception and quantitative indicators were inconsistent across the campus. Next slide. What was one key finding? And what we found was that with respect particularly to the quantitative indicators, that one of the most significant ones was that we had a decline in enrollment, which was negatively impacting budget. And so we are working now on developing a more comprehensive strategic enrollment management plan, which was one of the primary recommendations that came out of our Middle States self-study process. And we are heavily engaged in that right now. Next slide. Standard 7, governance, leadership, and administration. Do we have it? Yes, we have policies, organization, and governance structures that are clearly articulated. Do we do it? Yes, our organizations and our governance bodies meet regularly, provide reports, have plenty of meetings, and engage in evaluations. Does it work? To an extent. And again, as we've said before, inconsistently across the campus. We felt that communication was improving, but next slide, a key finding is that we have a tremendous amount of information that is shared across the college. However, it's not always easily accessible, and that is not easily accessible in two ways. One, everybody could not easily find the information that may be needed or that people were interested in, but also sometimes there was too much information, and the information that was available was not distilled or synthesized in a way that was meaningful to people. So we identified next steps as the college would benefit from a unified system to provide easy access to repository of information, and that the information provided should be really well designed for the users so that it made sense and it had meaning for them. Next slide.
So if you think about it, these three very simple questions, they help us find what needs to be fixed. They help us identify in a very precise way what is missing, what's not working, but also to find out why. So for example, let's go to the next slide. So we have a strategic enrollment plan, but it's out of date. We assessed our gen ed program, but we haven't addressed the key findings. We have evidence of a 10-year process and procedure, but it's not working for everyone. Asking these three questions helps us to identify if it's the plan that's the problem, if it's the policy that's the problem, if it's the practice that's the problem, or the process. And in focusing our attention on those three questions, in the answers to those three questions, being able to identify very precisely what exactly we need to fix in our institution or improve in our institution helps us as a whole improve our practice as an institution in supporting our students' learning. Nancy, next slide, Brian.
So to conclude our very quick description of our chapter, the institution benefits most and also meets the Middle States expectation, which goes beyond demonstration of compliance with the standards and requires demonstration of how assessment leads to improvement or innovation. Only when the assessment highlights the weaknesses and challenges, which is really sometimes very hard to do, in the plans and policies, the execution, or the outcomes. And finally, identifies possible courses of corrective action. And that concludes our presentation. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Dawn. I absolutely love that presentation, as I love chapter 20. And I do have a deep appreciation for your candor and your transparency and saying, what does it work? And I have to say, particularly on the last question, when you say, does it work? And then that addendum on that, does it work for all? How important that piece of it is too, right? Is it equitably applied? I love that. And I love the practicality of this. So thank you very, very much for sharing that. I think folks will have questions on your presentation specifically, but I want to remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat, because what we're going to do is go through a few more chapters and then offer the opportunity to go through your chat questions. So please keep adding your questions to the chat. Next slide. So the next thing Tara and I would like to do is just bring to your attention 4 other chapters that were suggested to us by the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. The book does include many others, of course, and the topics include everything from healthcare to the arts to business, in many different contexts for the application of assessment strategies. And I think Dawn and Nancy just gave us a great example of that can be applied in different environments, right? In a community college and a 4-year institution. I think you'll find throughout the book that the examples that are coming to you can be practical regardless of your specific institutional type. But what we want to do here is just give you a teaser about 4 other chapters that were suggested to us by the Middle States Commission. Next slide. So the first chapter is from the Jeffrey Lindauer and Patricia Coward authored Chapter 3, The Assessment of Student Learning in the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. This was an excellent example how accreditation was a catalyst for action. And I make no apologies for the fact that I'm a big proponent of self-study. I'm a big proponent of accreditation because it offers us the opportunity to be reflective, to take a hard look at our institution, look what we are doing really well and celebrate it, and then look for opportunities of improvement. I think Nancy and Dawn really highlighted in their presentation all the opportunities that they had. Obviously, they were doing things so well, but they were also very frank and candid about the opportunities they had for improvement. Well, this was true in Chapter 3. It was an accreditation visit that sparked this institution to do something different. And they formed an Outcomes Assessment Advisory Committee. Not that that in itself is different than what most of institutions do, but what I really liked, and I want to stress here, that its composition was 6 faculty members from the 3 different schools that they have in their college and 1 administrator. Very, very faculty focused. And because faculty were designing the processes and the policies, they came to find value and respect for assessment. They were developing the rubrics and the dashboard that allowed the institution to look at itself and say, how are we doing with respect to student learning outcome achievement? And the things that they discovered told them where they might want to modify their curriculum, where some courses maybe they want to change the order of the presentation of some courses, for example, but the faculty were discovering this themselves through their work. Now, it isn't any surprise, actually, the lessons that they learn and present here is that there should be an assessment person in each school, right? As Nancy and Dawn pointed out for their DEI example, they were doing DEI, but they didn't have a person in charge of it. And so one of the things they did was create that associate vice president position. Well, within every school, at this institution, they made sure there was an identified assessment person. Somebody would take care of the care and feeding of assessment for their school. They also determined that assessment needs constant attention. It's not something that you do periodically. Oh yeah, let's do that at the end of the year, check it off, get it done. No, this was something that became part of their culture. And in their chapter, they really described the process and the steps that they took to develop that culture, and emphasized over and over again that the whole process must be faculty driven. So this is, I'm not doing justice to this chapter at all. It's just a little teaser for you to read about it, but it's an example in a particular 4-year institution that you might learn something from, but keeping in mind that there are examples across the spectrum in many different disciplines as well. Next slide.
Yes, I'd also like to share Chapter 6, which is One Institution's Journey to Annual Program Assessment. This was written from 3 authors, Carol Trotman Carr, Dana Dunn, and Deborah Wetcher Hendricks from Moravian's Assessment College. And so within this, they created an assessment process about 20 years ago. And of course, 20 years ago, that's, when accreditors had mandates for such things, assessment, right? And so we've all been through this process. We probably are all very familiar with accreditation mandates 20 years ago, and we continue to revise and iterate and revise our assessment process over and over again. So I think we can all relate to such panic that our institutions have had over the past couple of years. But with that said, in an attempt to move away from that compliance kind of mindset towards a quality mindset, they also, just like the last chapter, formed an assessment committee. But this assessment committee was new, and the focus was on faculty involvement and the connection between assessment, teaching, and learning, which is very important and very critical if we're going to make assessment work on our campuses. So the institution focused on annually, they have a 6-step process, which we're all very familiar with. However, instead of using the traditional, assessment cycle, the plan, do, check, act type thing that we're all very familiar with, they reworded their process to focus on language that was meaningful to faculty. So they developed guiding questions that encouraged faculty to reflect on continuous improvement in quality learning and consider the positive impact the assessment process can have within their programs. So just like Chapter 20, the do we have it, does it work type reflection and guiding questions to get institutions thinking, this is the exact same thing that Moravian College did as well. So changing kind of the language that faculty can really think, what outcomes are most important? How do we know that it works? What did we learn from this? So really thinking about the language that we use in our assessment process and sharing that language with faculty to get them thinking about continuous improvement and the impact that the assessment process can really have within our programs. I'm going to hand it back to Jane Marie.
And I'd like to give you a very different context here from the U.S. Army War College, and David Dworek submitted this chapter to us. So this is an institution that is a graduate school, and their focus is on taking students to a mastery level of their profession. They're preparing students for success at the highest levels of government. So they make it a point of distinguishing. Yes, they do want the didactic learning and the theoretical learning, but they also want the practical learning and the skills development. Their new process that they developed was also sparked by an accreditation visit. And I do bring this to your attention because, again, sometimes having those peer reviewers, and they are peer reviewers from the accreditors, on your campus can bring out some wonderful suggestions that lead to action to benefit your institution. So in their case, they did have a report from their accreditor from their self-study visit that sparked them to develop these 4 goals. They wanted to demonstrate the degree of learning outcomes attainment in the students. They wanted to do that consistently and create a new system to improve the courses that is evidence-based. They also wanted to be able to make talent management decisions. And this was a little bit different than some of the institutions that we looked at because they were really looking at those future leaders in the highest levels of government. And how do you make decisions about recommendations for students? And they really made a point of saying that in the process of doing this, they wanted to minimize the additional work that they put on the faculty. They wanted to maybe get rid of some redundancies and some other things that they were doing that were no longer meaningful or beneficial, and then maybe transplant some of their energies to other areas. So I love the fact that it was actually one of their goals to minimize the additional work for faculty. And one of the things they developed is a new academic evaluation report. Their reporting structure was actually multi-level, and it's really, really interesting. And in the interest of time, I can't explain it all here, but they were looking at the whole student in different areas. Strategic thinking and written and oral communications is certainly an area that was very important, and they were evaluating. And they were using a rubric that was developed not so much to be prescriptive, but as a guide for the faculty. How do we place the students on the spectrum of where they are with respect to their learning in strategic thinking, written and oral communication? They also wanted to look at demonstrated knowledge, skills, and abilities. So these are more technical areas. They also looked at special projects. Now, this would be beyond the prescribed curriculum that everyone was doing, but the students are engaged in their own discrete special projects. And looking at those and having the faculty provide feedback in a narrative form helped them with their talent management efforts for the profession. And an example that they gave, if you have a lot of information on the students and how they were doing with respect to their didactic learning and their practical learning and their tactical learning and their strategic thinking, but also you had information that maybe they were experts in artificial intelligence, and that was documented, then when they're looking specifically for talent management in artificial intelligence, they know where to find that student, and they know how that student was represented by their faculty. So looking at their multi-level system that they developed allowed them to do more than just rank students with respect to GPA, right? We can all do that, look at the GPA, but really disaggregate that, look at how the students were doing in particular areas and particular skill and skill development so that they could specialize and make recommendations for these government positions. So it was really, yes, in some ways, it's similar to the processes that we use in assessment, but I think their 4-level approach and really focusing on disaggregating those fundamental skills in strategic thinking and their tactical skills, I think was really brilliantly done and really appreciated what they had to offer in this chapter. Next slide.
And the 5th chapter, 5th institute, well, 6 institutions, I guess, from Middle States, is chapter 19, and that's being SAGE, about institutional effectiveness, from Gutman Community College. So Gutman Community College is actually a fairly new college. It opened up its doors in 2012 with innovation in mind. All incoming students were required to complete a summer program prior to starting in the fall. They must also attend full-time. They have to participate in learning communities. They complete a structured common core. So they continued this concept of innovation by developing what's called the SAGE framework, the systematic approach for Gutman effectiveness, which is an evidence-based approach to the decision-making with the purpose of answering one question: how well are we collectively meeting our goals? So collectively meaning the institution, the faculty, the programs, the staff, the students, bringing everybody together and really talking about how are we all together as an institution meeting our goals. Each year, all units complete that SAGE profile, which has 3 overarching components. Here you have planning, inquiry, and insight. The goal is to integrate the planning and assessment and resource allocation. So bringing those 3 things together. I won't go into details about the SAGE framework. You can certainly find their template and read about their process in chapter 19. But I do want to share a few comments from the authors that I feel are great reminders for all assessment practitioners to keep in mind. They specifically mention in the chapter that institutional effectiveness is not about perfection. It's about reaching 100% compliance. I'm sorry, it's not about reaching 100% compliance in reporting, and it's not about reaching 100% achievement for all goals. But what it is about is that it's about all the people and the progress. So really thinking about that and taking that back to your institutions, that we have to work together. We have to be collective in our thinking and integrating it and not only focusing on that compliance, right? We don't have to be perfect. We just need to take action and reflect and try to make change. And again, thinking about that, it is about the people, it is about our students, it's about each other and making progress towards our goals. Next slide, please. So with that said, at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions. We do ask that you please indicate the chapter number for your questions so we kind of know which chapter you're talking about. But remember, we have quite a few chapters that we discussed. You could ask questions about the foreword from Dr. Perfetti, any of the chapters, and of course, general questions about the book in general, we're happy to answer.
So thank you, everyone. We have quite a few questions that have come in already, and I know we will be fielding some additional ones. And I'm going to kick off with one that as soon as it was presented in Dawn and Nancy's presentation, I knew a question would come in. And so if you could, and all of you can address it, but we'll start with Dawn, go to Nancy, and then to Jane Marie and Tara. But if you could talk a little bit more about how you assessed assessment and provide some examples.
So assessing assessment primarily fell to the members of our Institutional Outcomes Assessment Committee. And the committee members are representatives of all of our schools within our institution and also represent our co-curricular programs as well. So we have assessed assessment in many different ways. Two primary ways have been we've created rubrics, and we have applied those rubrics to those assessment reports and plans that the academic programs and the co-curricular programs and soon to be the service units have provided and turned in to the institution. So one way we have assessed assessment is to assess their assessments and whether or not and apply a rubric to those assessments. But there was a key way to assess the accountability of the assessments that turned out to be a very important part of our self-study process. We ask every program director and every division leader, every division VP to provide an annual report every year. One component of that annual report is to summarize the key assessment findings and to talk about how they were using those findings to improve practice. When we assessed the annual reports prior to 2019, that's when we identified that we had an accountability gap. We had individuals assessing, but they weren't summarizing the assessment results in the annual reports. And as a consequence of not having captured it there, we weren't able to capture it in the budget and strategic planning process. So we've applied rubrics to their assessments to determine whether or not they meet our standards. And we also have identified gaps in the reporting of the results. Nancy, how did you handle it at your institution?
Yeah, I think what we looked at was beyond if the assessments were being done, how useful were they? Did the assessment result in a pat on the back? And oftentimes it did. You know, we assessed it, it's working well, we're going to keep things the way they are. And we have a number of departments that in doing so prefer to assess the same thing every year. And so what we were looking for was an indication that an assessment identified an issue or a problem and led to some improvement. We are trying now, I mean, I think we observed that as part of our self-study process. And now we're working on the development of rubrics to evaluate how the assessment results and impacts are reported in the annual plans. I didn't even know that that was something that you did at your school, Dawn, but we are working on those rubrics right now, because I think it's really, you know, we may make it sound easy in this quick presentation to be upfront and honest about what's challenging, but it's really hard. It's really hard to help people understand that it's the identification of the problem that is a prerequisite for improvement.
I love that. And I do want to just offer another perspective from my institution is a high intensity research institution, and we have schools that run the gamut from medical to engineering, arts, businesses, education. And everybody has their unique way of doing assessment. But like you want some strategy for pulling it all together. And not unlike you, we have a committee, and it's called the University Committee on Educational Effectiveness Assessment, UCEEA, named that way because their primary focus is Standard 5, Educational Effectiveness Assessment. And just one thing I want to share is, I don't want to take up a lot of time on this, but the structure of the annual report tries to really respect the diversity of the assessment strategies. The Eastman School of Music does not approach assessment the way the engineering school does, right? Totally different. But they do the reports in 4 chapters, if you will. What were your principal goals this year that you were assessing, or that what you were trying to improve? What's the activities that supported those goals? How did you assess the achievement of those, and what do you plan to do next? And just documenting those and reporting on those kind of keeps you honest, because you look back at the last year's ones, because nobody achieves these goals in a year, right? They're 3-4 year goals, maybe even longer if you're trying to change something big and you're changing the curriculum in a 4-year program. So it keeps a documentation of what goals you were working on every given year, what activity you did. Oh yeah, how did we do on that? Let's follow up. What are we going to do next? So I think just the process of collecting these and sharing them across very disparate departments and schools helps us learn from each other, but it keeps yourself honest too. What am I working on? What am I trying to improve? So you're constantly assessing yourself in that manner.
Great, thank you. So we do have some additional questions that have come in, and I think we'll stay along the theme of assessing effectiveness, whether that be of assessment, or another question was of effective pedagogy. If you could provide some examples of the assessment of effective pedagogy. And I think that surfaced for, again, Dawn and Nancy's presentation. So if we want to start there, and then we can circle to Tara and Jane Marie as well.
Nancy, do you want to talk about your high impact practices?
Sure. I'll give one example, because we have sort of a very full professional development program. We had 3 faculty members who created a seminar for new faculty to introduce them to what is effective community college teaching and how that impacts community college student learning. And one of the components of that seminar for faculty, which I should say was really impressive, because I saw a question in the chat about, you know, how do you engage faculty and department chairs in this process? These 3 faculty members made a presentation to our department chairs about the importance of engaging new faculty in learning about how to best teach community college students. And they made such a compelling case that the department chairs agreed that faculty should participate in a year-long seminar with reassigned time attached to it. And this has been going on for a few years. And one of the components of that is that they do learn about, effective pedagogical practice, which includes things like project-based learning, contextual-based learning, use of e-portfolio, use of self-reflection, a number of things that they're exposed to, in addition to a focus on assessment. And each of those faculty members has to do an assessment project over the course of the year that they are learning about and practicing some of these high impact practices. And as part of that effort, they are required to present the findings of their assessment at an institutional conference that we host on teaching and learning. And so I think that's a nice example where the faculty are doing their own assessment of it, and then they're sharing the results. And they often will look at what the learning outcomes have been for the students, as well as what the student success rates are in their courses. So that's my example.
I can chime in here too, just to give kind of at my institution in looking at effective pedagogy. You know, for us, every 3 years, we kind of close out our assessment cycle here. And with that closeout, I don't want to say closeout, but it's a reflection. We've incorporated a program impact report is what it's called. But we ask faculty to think about, okay, now that you've assessed these student learning outcomes over, you know, the past 3 years, what is the data telling you, and how has that data impacted your pedagogy, right, in the classroom? What have you done differently? What do you need to do differently? What strategies have you changed, or pedagogies have you used that you weren't using because of the assessment data that you've received? So again, just like Nancy mentioned, really encouraging faculty to think about what's been going on, what data are we seeing, what do we need to change, right? Do we need to change our teaching strategies? Do we need to add things? Do we need to remove, you know, what's working, what's not working in our classrooms, and kind of looking at it that way. So it's assessing, it's getting faculty to think about and reflecting on assessing themselves, right? In addition to assessing their programs and their curriculum and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I like that. I like that approach. The question kind of scared me at first because, frankly, that language can get you into trouble, right?
Yeah.
When you say assessment of pedagogy, the faculty, oh, you're going to assess what I do in the classroom. You're going to tell me I'm not any good. You're going to try to eliminate my program, et cetera, et cetera. And it sounds like a blame thing instead of an ownership thing. And I tell you, one of the chapters in the book, it was chapter 5 specifically, and it was done in the Institute of Indian Arts. They really looked at the whole faculty body owning the success of the students. So rather than say, okay, we're going to assess your pedagogical strategies, let's take a look at what the students have done. Let's look at a student presentation of a work and talk about what they have learned. So when you have a discussion about what the students have learned, then it naturally leads to maybe something that they didn't learn that you would have liked to see them learn, and then sharing strategies for how we can get the students to learn that. And then faculty sharing maybe pedagogical strategies, so that we're not assessing for the pedagogy, we're assessing for the student learning. Did the students learn what we wanted them to learn? And if that is always the driver, the focus is not on the way the faculty are teaching it, the way they are presenting it, but actually, are the students learning what we want them to learn? And looking objectively at that and seeing what we see, then we can back that up and say, okay, if we're seeing what we see, we must be doing something right. This is great. Let's keep doing it. Or, gee, is there a way that we could get the students to move along so that everybody is owning the process of student learning? And one example of this comes up again and again in different places is writing. Like, so if the pedagogical strategy for writing 101, and you're saying, well, our students don't write well, are we going to blame the faculty who teach the first year of writing? No, we're going to say, what are the opportunities that we can have to enhance our student writing ability across the curriculum? How can we all own a piece of that? How can we all own where we want the students to go? So anyway, I just have to say I'm pushing back a little bit against this idea of assessing the pedagogy. I would rather assess the student achievement of the outcomes and find out what pedagogy was working and what wasn't. So just a little bit different spin on it.
But I'd like to push back a little bit on the idea of assessing pedagogy during time of COVID, because what we have discovered at our institution is that all of our tried and true pedagogical approaches that we have become comfortable with had to shift in a rather dramatic and instant way in a very short period of time. And so at our institution, we have assessed whether or not the training that and support we provided faculty helped them develop more in their toolkit for pedagogical approaches for online learning. And we did assess, and we're continuing to assess the students' perceptions of that online learning. We changed a few of the questions in the course evaluation instrument, the course rating instrument, just to capture what their perceptions were. How did it feel? Were they able to follow the online? What were some of the barriers to their learning that they encountered in this course? So the pedagogy for online teaching and learning becomes something that was so critically important for us to have a conversation about and for us to gather more data and information about from our students, from our faculty, from the staff who are trying to support faculty.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. My problem isn't with assessing the pedagogical approaches. It's in the language that we use when we do it. So
Right.
that the focus is always on, so that the faculty don't feel that we are assessing them. And I think that's what assessment a lot of time gets a bad name and a sour taste in the mouth from faculty. Yes, we do need to assess if what we're doing is work, but if we do it through the lens of what is working for the students. And so I have no problem with doing it. I just have a problem with how we frame it, so that the faculty are always partners in the ultimate goal of seeing that the students learn whatever environment they happen to be in. And in this case, you're absolutely right. It got shifted pretty quickly to online. We want to make sure the students are still learning at the same rate that we were hoping.
Thank you both. So I know one of the questions repeatedly here and elsewhere where we have all been engaged in conversations has been around faculty buy-in. And so there have been questions in the chat about the faculty buy-in. I think Dawn, Jane Marie, Tara, Nancy, you all have addressed pieces of that through the presentation and in your responses. Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight about gaining faculty buy-in based on what you've presented or what you've seen in the publication?
I'd like to address what I've discovered at my institution in working with faculty. One is I don't like the phrase buy-in, but the second piece that I've discovered at my institution is that faculty are researchers. So if you allow your faculty members to articulate a research question that's related to those student learning outcomes, that makes that particular assessment so critically important and focused for that faculty member. And there is not a faculty member on staff that isn't interested in researching the learning of their students when it's couched in that way. And especially when a faculty member or members have the opportunity to articulate what that research question is for that cycle of review. That's the power, because that's when faculty are going to be actively interested in finding out that information, and they can use their skill set to do so.
I agree with you on the buy-in. I'm always in any of my presentations, let's build excitement. Let's not work for buy-in. Buy-in sounds like I'm selling something, right? But an example from the book that I found a lot of meaning in, it came from Boston College, actually. And they were working on assessing formation of the whole student. And that's a very difficult thing in the affective domain. And they tried doing different things. They used MSCHE survey, and they didn't like what they were able to garner from this, because this affective skill they were looking for really wasn't captured in a standardized assessment. And they ended up engaging students in the process and saying, this is what we're trying to assess. what's a good way to do that? And just a quote from the book, it's that their changes led to incorporating the students into the assessment process, not as data subjects, but as learning outcomes partners. And I thought that was, woo, brilliant. That's a wonderful way to put it. They are partners in this and asking them to it. So getting faculty involved in assessment, or us involved with faculty as they assess, is wonderful. And I think that if we take it a step further and we incorporate the students in something, we're trying to discover if you're learning X, Y, and Z, and we're not happy with what maybe our process is. What do you think? How can we assess, or how can we determine what you have learned? And sometimes getting brilliant ideas from the students as well. So I think, yes, we involve the faculty. In fact, they should be leading it, but also think about the student involvement too. And I thought that was a really nice observation I picked up from the book.
And I'll just add to that, I think for me, reading through all the chapters in the book is really just faculty engagement. I mean, all the chapters in the book, to some extent, have engaged faculty in the process from start to finish, recognizing that, faculty are expertise. They have expertise in their specific areas and disciplines, but they're not possibly, assessment practitioners. So, but being engaged and having them involved in the process and asking questions, what works, what's not working, and realizing that assessment is certainly not one size fits all, and bringing in that faculty expertise and helping them help build the process for their programs. I always tell faculty that if your assessment process isn't meaningful, manageable, and sustainable, scrap it and start over, right? I mean, it's okay to fail, right? Let's be innovative. Let's change. We want it to be meaningful, right? We don't want you wasting your time. We don't want it to be a burdensome effort. We don't want you to get frustrated. We don't want you to collect data and then, give us some, crap in, crap out, right? We really and truly want you to improve your programs. And so if it is not working, then let us help you figure out a way that we can make it work. So really, bringing them into the conversation and engaging them in all aspects of your process.
I'll just add one thing, which is maybe a positive thing and maybe a problem for us. One of the things that we bragged about in our self-study in 2019 was that because we valued effective assessment, we committed resources to providing at least one faculty member in each academic department to get reassigned time to become a leader in assessment in their department. And that was a really great thing. And we developed a lot of enthusiasm, and we had faculty assisting like-minded faculty. But given some concerns about finances now that we've experienced some enrollment decline, the reassigned time has been taken away, at least in the short term. And one of the incentives that, we have continued the faculty participation in what we call our assessment council, and every department has continued. This is the second year without reassigned time. And one of the things that is an impetus for continued participation is that we made so much progress, and what we had done that was successful was well recognized by our self-study evaluation team, that we really need to be able to continue to sustain that work even without the resources, and we'll see the value down the road. I'm hoping that happens, but more self-disclosure about challenges that we face.
Thank you for that, Nancy. We did have a question to gain some thoughts on an assessment staff member being full-time or part-time. And I know we are tight on time and we have to move along, but I did want to mention that your comments did address a question that had been placed in the chat in that regard. I think we'll go to the next slide, and I will preface it with, there's lots of questions about rubrics and tools referenced in the publication, and remind me where to find the publication and remind me of the title. So it's perfect transition to this slide for you, Jane Marie.
Oh, this is great. So yes, I have been shamelessly promoting this book, but first of all, I want to say that this isn't lining the pockets of Tara and me. We have donated all of the royalties to the Association for Assessment of Learning in Higher Education. So I just wanted to make that known. But the reason I'm promoting the book is because I truly believe that this is a resource. As Tara said, after we did this conversation with accreditors panel session, people want to know, what do the accreditors think a good assessment? What are some examples? And these are 20 different chapters of exemplars specifically from the accreditors, and they're very, very different. And you heard different approaches, right, with the 4 panelists here from different institutions, and that is magnified throughout. Everybody has a different way of doing this. The book is available right from Stylus, and if you order it through Stylus, through this webinar, they have been kind enough to offer a 20% discount plus free shipping. So if you use that discount code from the Stylus website as opposed to going to Amazon, you can get that, and it's available as a paperback, hard book, or an ebook available. Tara, other?
I don't think so.
This has truly been a labor of love for us. And again, I just want to say that I am so grateful for the encouragement and support of Dr. Heather Perfetti, as she was the very first person we asked about the viability of this. And she was so encouraging and gave us these wonderful examples. And you saw it in Dawn and Nancy, they're amazing. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to share these exemplars today.
Thank you. And I think a key takeaway is you heard Jane Marie talk about words matter. And I know that when we came together for the AALHE conference, we would frequently talk about reframing assessment in a way that is different than maybe captured at a particular college or university. And I know we took questions from the Twitter feed. We were taking questions from the space at the conference. And really, we approached it eventually as we've got some myths to bust. And we were very effective at reinforcing the value of assessment and all of the stakeholders who can invest in quality assessment that matters. And so I want to again thank all of our panelists as well as our engaged participants who really presented some exceptional questions that focused our time together on topics that were most of interest to those of us in this space. I also have to thank the Middle States Commission on Higher Education staff who supported the event, including Vicki Clark, Brian Kirshner, and Steve Pugliese. I also want to remind all of you to join us on social media and at future events of the Commission. And I want to promote a couple of our upcoming events before we conclude today's webinar. On October 12th, from 1 to 3, we will host a webinar, Improving Distance Education Quality, which includes representatives from our commission, the National Council for State Authorization, Reciprocity Agreements, also known as NC-SARA, and Quality Matters. And we're going to collaboratively address quality assurance as it relates to distance education. We also have on November 8th, from 1 to 2:30, the transfer experience, creating a more equitable and successful post-secondary system. Both of those events are free. We also want to encourage you, if you are with us at this presentation, to provide us with some recommendations for webinar topics you would like to see in the future. And finally, we will be hosting our first ever virtual annual conference, New Horizons for Higher Education, on December 14th and 15th, and we hope that you will join us there. While it's not free, it will be an affordable event, and registration opens on October 4th. You can visit our website at www.msche.org for more details on all of those events, and we continue to stay engaged with us, to view us as a partner, and call upon us when we may be of assistance on behalf of the commission. This does conclude today's program. Stay safe and be well.